r/NoSleep. Posted by u/withywoodwitch. I work in a nursing home, and something strange is happening to the residents. This is going to be long. Not just to read, but to write. So I will have to split it into multiple parts. But I haven't seen anyone talking about this, so I think maybe I need to. This might just be the most well-kept secret ever, for now, but if my instincts are right, this is going to be a major change we are going to have to learn how to deal with. At first, I thought it was an isolated incident. But now I know it is not. Everyone will have their own memory of how this all started. For me, it began in a stuffy room, watching an old man's chest rise and fall with decreasing purpose until it finally stopped. It's important to me that you know about him. He wasn't just a case. He wasn't patient zero. He was a man I was very fond of and enriched the lives of many. His name was Bert. He loved children, though he had none of his own. In the old days he was a children's entertainer. He did puppet shows and magic tricks that enthralled his young audiences. He was a kind man with a great sense of humor. He liked crosswords and cricket and puns. Really bad puns. I always joked with him that he should have been a father because he had the dad joke down to a fine art. He ended his days in the nursing home where I worked. Twice, he ended his days. I'm going to tell you about both of them. The first time Bert died was a quiet affair. He had been going downhill for a while. And whilst he'd always been an active sort of man even in his 80s, for the few weeks preceding his death he'd had trouble walking, up till the point we needed to use a wheelchair to get him from A to B. He hated it, hated having to rely on us, wait for one of us to attend to him and assist him into his chair, whereas before he could have just taken a stroll to the dining room by himself. He used to like to walk around the grounds of the home, and when I had time I would make sure I wheeled him around for some fresh air. He liked birds too, and would point them out on our walks. The final couple of days of his life he was confined to his bed, and for the most part he wasn't really there at all. He faded in and out and talked nonsense when he could talk at all, little snippets of his life doled out and recovered memories that bore no relevance to what was happening to him in the present. From what I surmised hearing him mutter, he'd had a happy life, and I was glad he was able to relive it in his last remaining days, rather than be trapped in the reality of his failing body in the small room he was hidden away in. I was with him when he died. People working in nursing homes get a sixth sense about when people are going to pass, and even though my shift ended at 2 o'clock I volunteered to sit with him. He had family, but they all lived too far away, and I didn't want Bert to die alone. I took a chair near his bed and sat, listening to the sound of traffic outside his window and the sounds of the nursing home beyond his shut door. One of the housekeepers was singing in the corridor near us, and the afternoon shift was springing into action, sorting laundry and doing tea rounds. Bert and I were suspended in a drowsy, morbid bubble and life continued on all around regardless with all its noise and mild drama. Bert's breathing was labored, and every time he sucked air into his lungs it made me wince from the effort it took. He sounded bubbly and hoarse, a man drowning within his own mortal form, and I wished for his own sake that he would give up the fight. I drifted, nearly asleep. The room was warm and I had been up early. I was in a half-dream in which Bert was walking around the grounds with me, pointing out a magpie perched on the fence. One for sorrow, he told me, and I laughed. It was just a superstition. But he turned to me with his face full of sadness and shook his head. The magpie squawked at that, sounding more like a crow than a magpie, a grating noise that dragged me from my doze, and on waking I realized it wasn't a bird crowing, it was Bert's breathing that had made such an awful noise. The death rattle. I had heard it before, but the ugly sound never failed to distress me. It upset me even more so knowing one of my favorite residents was making it. I watched as his chest rose again, painfully inflating, and sank down with a drawn-out gargle. I waited. 30 seconds. A minute. 2 minutes. Bert was gone. I'd witnessed too many deaths in that place to be overly sentimental. In a few days his room would be bare of his personal effects, sanitized, and ready for a new resident, but I did pause for a moment to pay my own respects to a lovely man. It's odd being in a room with a dead body. It's like the exact opposite feeling reported on paranormal TV shows that one gets when one is being watched but nobody is there. You're there with a physical form, clearly visible, but the spirit has departed, and despite their presence the room is empty of all life but yours. I have to stress that, after everything that happened after, I did not feel Bert's presence at all. After I'd gathered my thoughts, I left the room and went to find one of the nurses. The morning shift had 4 carers and 2 trained nurses, the afternoon shift ran on a skeleton staff of 3 carers and 1 trained nurse. It was my bad luck that on that particular afternoon there was a male nurse called Terry manning the ship. Terry and I had never got on. He was a nurse, but taking night classes in business law, and I always got the feeling he never really liked the people he was paid to care for. He was cold, with little compassion to spare, and, worse than that, he was lazy. True to form, I found him still in the office. His feet were propped up on a chair, and he was sipping coffee whilst reading the local paper. He looked up when I came in, apparently surprised I was still there, but didn't move his feet or put down his reading matter. "Bert has died," I told him. "You'd better call his relatives." That made him move. He sighed, as though Bert's death was the most inconvenient thing ever, and put both his mug and his paper down. "Okay," he said. "I'll deal with it." I went to the staff room to change from my uniform into my civvies. I was sad, but one learns to deal with sadness when one is working with people who haven't long left to live. I was wondering who would take Bert's place in his room, and whether they would be nice or not, when Terry called to me from down the corridor. He was standing outside Bert's room with his hands on his hips, his face bearing a disgruntled expression. "Were you trying to be funny, or are you just incompetent?" he said, seeing me poke my head around the door. "What do you mean?" Terry didn't answer, just motioned to me with an impatient gesture and disappeared back inside Bert's room. I put my boots on and went to join him. Terry's shoulders blocked my view of Bert's bed, and I elbowed him out the way. I couldn't imagine what Terry wished to upbraid me for. I had done everything by the book, and messing around with the body was beyond my pay grade, but once I caught sight of what lay in the bed I caught my breath. Bert's eyes were open, and that alone I could have brushed off, but I couldn't brush off the fact that he was moving. His arms were twitching, small, jerking movements that somehow reminded me of the experiments done on frogs' legs with electricity. And if that weren't enough, his head was moving from side to side in tiny, negative gestures, shaking away the notion that he was dead, denying it all. His rheumy eyes flicked towards me when I gasped, lips pulling back from his teeth in a ghastly attempt at a smile. His gums were blue and shrunk back, making his teeth look too big for his mouth. "Hello," he rasped, his voice sounding thick and wet, and somehow as if it came from a great distance. "Dead, is he?" said Terry, looking pretty lively to me. He was glaring at me. I was aware of the pressure of his gaze, and the reproval it held, but in that moment I didn't care about his opinion of me. I should have been happy with my mistake, I suppose. I should have been glad my friend Bert was still with us. But I couldn't be glad. He had died, you see. I had no doubt of that. He had died, and no matter what your stance on religion and the soul's purpose, I had been in that room with an empty shell before I had gone to see Terry. There was no getting around it. Bert was struggling, and it seemed he wanted to sit up. He hadn't been able to sit unaided for at least a week, maybe 2, but he was trying. Seeing him move made me uncomfortable on a level I couldn't quite identify. It was as if I was watching stop-motion animation that had been badly executed, with gaps in the animation, and his lurches seemed to happen far too slowly. "Give me a hand," said Terry, unperturbed, and he took a place at Bert's right side, hooking his wrist under Bert's armpit and bracing himself. I knew what Terry was asking me to do. It was a basic task I had executed a multitude of times, a simple propping up of a resident in a sitting position, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. It would mean touching Bert, and all of a sudden the idea of touching him was disgusting. I hung back, reluctant to make any form of contact, and Terry clicked his tongue at me over his shoulder. "Come on," he urged. Despite my reticence, I found my feet moving by instinct. I was a good worker. Conscientious and always ready to help. I didn't give a shit about the company that paid my wages, but I gave a shit about the people I cared for, and when someone asked me to help one of them, I always helped. I took myself to Bert's left side. I knew what I had to do, had done it countless times, but on this occasion I hesitated. I didn't want to touch him. Once, a friend had offered to install a new aerial for my TV, and I had been asked to put my hand into a wall cavity to feed the cable through. I had done so, blindly reaching into the dark space clotted with dust and cobwebs, and my hand had lighted not on the cable but the desiccated remains of a bird. It had been dry and long dead, but after I had touched it I had washed my hand numerous times in an attempt to rid myself of the feeling of that arid little corpse against my palm. Standing there next to Bert's bed, I had that same feeling of repulsion when asked to touch him. I knew it would feel loathsome, and that I would never be able to rid myself of that feeling. I forced myself to get a grip, on myself and on him. His skin was cool and clammy, and my fingers sank into the doughy flesh of his upper arm far too easily. I could imagine my hands leaving an imprint in that unpleasant texture indefinitely. Terry started to count, on 3, and just as I was bracing myself to heave the old man upright, Bert turned his head to me. "Hope you're feeling strong," he croaked. "I'm a dead weight." He dropped one eyelid in a wink that took too long to execute, and coughed laughter. The exchange gave me an icy chill that crawled down my chest and into my belly. It was a joke. I knew it was a joke. Bert loved to joke. But that particular pun, delivered then? I hated it. Along with the wink, which Terry hadn't noticed, it had an entirely different flavor from Bert's usual light-hearted banter. That wink sealed it, told me there was something he was sharing only with me, and some part of him liked that I was uncomfortable. I sat him up anyway. Propped him up with pillows. I took refuge in my efficiency and shut my mind off. Bert had seemed heavier than usual, despite the fact that his illness had wasted his body away in the past weeks, but I decided that was my imagination. "Do you want anything, Bert?" asked Terry. "Nice cup of tea, maybe?" "Oh, yes," said Bert. "I'm dying for a cup of tea." "Okay, we'll get that to you. Brenda will fetch it, won't you, Bren?" He was already leaving the room, confident I'd spring into action, and the thought of having to be alone in the room with Bert made me panic. I followed close on Terry's heels, and as I reached the corridor I realized something wonderful: my shift had ended hours ago. I didn't have to do a single thing except go home. "Sorry, Terry," I said, aware I didn't sound sorry at all. "I'm off duty. Maybe you should get Bert his tea?" Before he had a chance to reply I had ducked into the changing room and grabbed my bag, and was out of the front door with his protest trailing behind me. I showered when I got home. Turned the heat up till the water was scalding. I felt filthy, infected, almost. And even though I scrubbed myself till my skin was red I still felt dirty afterwards, as if my contact with Bert had left a foul, invisible film over me. By the time I'd eaten and watched TV and read a little, I felt more comfortable. If Terry were to suggest I'd overreacted I would have ripped him a new asshole, but to admit it to myself wasn't so hard. I'd been mistaken. Nothing more, nothing less. I'd seen quite a few deaths in my time, but I wasn't an expert. Everyone was different and I shouldn't place such importance on gut feelings. Bert hadn't died. I had been wrong. I was very confident about that. Unfortunately,